is a ridge in the Smoky Mountains that does not appear on any survey filed after 1878, though 4 men climbed it that year, with brass instruments slung over their shoulders and a government contract folded in a coat pocket, certain, the way only men who have never once been wrong before can be certain, that they would have it mapped and be back down in time for supper. Only one of those men came down before the first snow. He came down speaking a name that was not his own, wearing boots that were not his hands scraped raw, though he had no memory of falling, and carrying a book that had not existed when he went up, a book that page by page remembered things that had not happened yet, in a hand that matched his own a little too closely for comfort. For 130 years, the Cherokee families who kept the base of that ridge told their children a single rule: pass down the way you pass down a scar. Never answer a voice on the mountain that already knows your name. One woman broke that silence exactly once in her 91 years on a porch above Sorrow Creek to a stranger with a notebook who thought he had come to write about an old woman's memories. What she gave him instead was the true accounting of the widow's reach, who went up what came down wearing their faces, and the one debt that mountain has been collecting, one generation at a time, ever since. By the time she finished, he understood why nobody in that hollow says her name after dark, not because she is gone, because saying it might be enough to call something back. My name doesn't matter here. What matters is that in the autumn of 1907, I was a newspaper man from Knoxville, sent up into the Smokies to write a gentle little feature about an old woman who remembered the mountains before the railroads came through. I expected an afternoon of tea and nostalgia. I got the coldest story I have ever carried out of those hills, and I have carried a few. Before I take you up onto that ridge with me, I need something from you, because a story like this is better shared than kept. If your chest has already gone tight, if you felt that particular cold settle in behind your collarbone while reading the hook, do one thing for me right now. Hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means when the next case comes across my desk, you're the first to hear it in the dark. And while you're here, leave me a comment with where you're listening from, the country, the city, the room you're sitting in. I read every single one. There is something about knowing exactly which kitchen table, which passenger seat, which porch light is keeping you company tonight, that makes telling these stories feel less like shouting into an empty room. One more thing, and then I promise we go up the mountain, and we do not come back down until the story is finished properly with an ending. Not like some of the broken, half-told accounts that circulate out there, missing their final chapters. If you like your horror slow, true to the old hill towns, and willing to sit in silence when silence is what the story needs, like this video now, before you forget. It tells the channel this is exactly the kind of story you came for, and it helps put this in front of somebody else's sleepless night too. Now, let's go meet Nuna Swiftwater. Nuna Swiftwater was 91 years old when I met her, and she had the stillness of someone who had already said everything she planned to say in this life. and was only waiting to see if anyone worth telling would come and ask. Her eyes were the pale, clouded gray that comes late to some old people, but they moved like a much younger woman's eyes, tracking me up that path the way a hawk tracks something that hasn't yet decided whether it's prey. Her cabin sat above a creek the county maps called Sorrow Creek, though nobody local used that name aloud if they could help it. They called it the Low Water, and pointed instead of naming it, the way you might point at a dog you weren't sure was rabid. Even from the path below, that creek made almost no sound at all, a thin, careful trickle over stone, as though the water itself had learned a long time ago to move through that hollow without drawing attention to itself. She was already on the porch when I came up the path, a shawl over her shoulders despite the warm afternoon, and she watched me the whole climb without once looking away, the way a woman watches whether she has seen turn bad before. "You're here about the ridge," she said, before I had introduced myself, before I had said a single word about my assignment. I asked how she knew. She said, because nobody climbs this creek for any other reason anymore. I told her I had come to write about her memories of the old mountain trails, the Cherokee removal era, the disappearing hollows. She listened to my whole polished pitch and then said only, "That is not the story you're going to write. Sit." I sat on the step below her, the way you sit when an elder tells you to sit, and you have already stopped being the one asking the questions. She poured nothing, offered nothing, and looked out at a particular notch in the ridgeline for a long, unhurried moment. Somewhere behind the cabin, the birds that had been going steadily since I arrived went quiet all at once, the way birds go quiet before a storm that has not yet shown itself on any horizon, and neither of us remarked on it. My father guided 4 white men up that ridge in the autumn of 1878, she said. I was 2 years old. I do not remember it happening. I remember every single day after, because my father was one of 2 men who came back down, and he was never the same man again. She told me the ridge had a name in her language that meant, roughly, the place that keeps count. Her grandmother's generation called it that because the mountain there was known to take exactly 1 person from any group that climbed past its second creek crossing, never more, never fewer, and never anyone but the one whose debt was oldest. Though no one still living, she said, could tell you any more, whose debt had been the first. The white surveyors did not believe in debts, she said. They believed in contracts, a government contract signed in Knoxville to map the coal seams under that ridge for a mining company that never once asked the Cherokee, who already knew what was up there. My father told them not to go, she said. He told the foreman exactly what he would tell you now, if he were alive to tell it himself. The mountain does not forget an unpaid thing, and somebody, sometime, owed it a debt nobody living could remember incurring. They went anyway. I am going to tell you what happened to them in the order it happened, because you asked for a story. And I have kept this one long enough. The mining company had sent 4 men and a wagon up from Knoxville that September. Absalom Rourke, the lead surveyor, 41 years old, a careful man who had never lost a man in the field in 19 years of work. Micah Doss, his chainman, 28, Thaddeus Pell, an apprentice barely 20 who had begged onto the crew for the wages, and Nathaniel Speck, the cook and teamster, older than the rest, missing 2 fingers from a sawmill accident he never explained. Nuna's father, Walker Swiftwater, had been hired in Knoxville itself, through a broker, without anyone telling Rourke that the guide he'd contracted was the same man who had, 3 years earlier, refused a different survey crew at the exact same creek crossing and walked home rather than take their money. They reached the base of the ridge on the second day at a homestead kept by a widow named Adeline Foss, whose husband had gone up that ridge 9 years before to cut timber and had come back down 11 days later, walking, breathing, answering to his name, but wrong in some way she could describe only as borrowed, and who had died within the year of something the local doctor wrote down simply as wasting, though Adeline told anyone who asked that her husband had simply stopped recognizing his own reflection sometime in his final months, and had taken to keeping every mirror in the house covered. Adeline fed them and warned them in the same breath, the way Walker had told Nuna Hill. Women always did it, because turning away a traveler was a sin, but sending him up that ridge unwarned was a worse one. The second crossing, she told Rourke. Whatever you do, don't camp past the second crossing. Rourke, polite and unmoved, explained his contract, his instruments, his 19 years without incident. Adeline said only, 19 years is exactly how long a debt can sit quiet before it comes due, and would not explain further, no matter how he pressed her, only refilling his cup as though the matter were already settled and there was nothing further worth saying about it. Walker took them as far as the second creek crossing the next morning and stopped there, exactly as he had stopped for the crew 3 years before. He told Rourke plainly, I will camp here. I will wait 5 days. If you are not down by the 5th evening, I go home and I tell the company you did not come back, and that is the last thing I will do for this contract. Rourke shook his hand. Doss shook his hand. Pell, young and unbothered, laughed and said the old stories were exactly the kind of thing that kept guide fees high in these hollows, and asked Walker, half joking, what exactly was supposed to happen to them. Walker answered him without any humor at all. He said, somewhere up there is a marker tree with a name carved into it. If you find your own name already carved there, waiting for you, that is the mountain telling you it already knows how this ends. Do not answer anything that calls you by name from ahead of where your own party is standing. They crossed the second creek at 9 in the morning, according to Rourke's own field book, later recovered. The book records the crossing, the bearing, the weather, routine, careful, a professional's hand. The next entry, time-stamped 2 hours later, notes that the party had crossed a second creek matching the first crossing's exact description, though none of them remembered fording anything since morning. Below that entry, in the same neat hand, Rourke had written only, Doss says this is the same creek. I am inclined to agree with him, and I do not like that I am inclined to agree with him. That was the last ordinary sentence Cornelius Rourke ever wrote in that book, and Nuna told me the rest of it exactly the way her father had told her, which is exactly how I am about to tell it to you. By early afternoon, the hardwoods had gone strange around them. Not a different species, Doss noted in his own pocketbook, but the same familiar oaks and hickories rendered slightly incorrect, as though someone who had only ever seen a drawing of these trees had grown them from memory instead of from seed. The bark felt wrong under the hand, too, Doss wrote, smoother than it should be, faintly warm in patches where warmth had no business being, as though the trunks were skinned over something that had not quite finished cooling. The light did not fall the way light should fall. Pell, walking last, noticed that his own shadow pointed toward the sun instead of away from it, and said nothing about it to the others for nearly an hour because saying it out loud felt like it would make it more true. At 2 in the afternoon they found the marker tree, an old chestnut, wide as a wagon wheel, its bark scarred with generations of carved initials left by hunters, surveyors, and lovers going back decades, the kind of tree every hill community keeps as an accidental ledger of who has passed through, the oldest carvings gone soft and shapeless with age, the newest ones still pale and raw against the dark bark. Rourke ran his hand across the bark, looking for old benchmark carvings to confirm their position, and stopped when his fingers found 4 fresh letters cut clean and pale into the wood. A. Rourke, carved in a hand not his own, at a height exactly level with his own eyes, the sap still faintly wet at the edges of the cut. He said nothing to the others. He turned the party 20 degrees east of the marked bearing, away from the direction the compass wanted to take them, and told Doss only that the tree was unreliable as a benchmark. Doss, checking his own compass minutes later, quietly noted that the needle had begun drifting in slow circles, unable to settle on north at all. They stopped for the night in a shallow hollow that Pell swore had not been on the map Rourke carried, a perfectly circular clearing with no undergrowth at all, bare dark soil, ringed by trees that leaned inward very slightly, as though listening. The soil under their boots was fine and oddly cool to the touch, even close by the fire. And when Speck knelt to clear a spot for his bedroll, he found no roots in it at all, not one, as though nothing had ever tried to grow there, and nothing ever would. Speck built the fire. As it caught, all 4 men noticed, though none said it aloud until much later, that the flames threw 4 shadows onto the trees behind them instead of 4 men's worth of shadow, the extra shadow standing very slightly apart from the rest, its outline a shape none of them quite claimed. Just after dark, a bell began to ring somewhere below them in the hollow, clear, close, unmistakably a bell, though none of them had heard of any church, farmhouse, or livestock within a full day's walk of that ridge, and no bell of that clarity carries a mile through hardwood forest without an open field to carry it. Pell asked, half laughing, to cover how unsteady his own voice had gone, whether anyone else heard it. Speck said he did. Doss said he did. Rourke, staring into the fire, said only, "I heard my name inside it." And I would not be drawn into saying anything further about what he meant. Nobody asked him to repeat it. Nobody wanted him to. Some time past midnight, Thaddeus Pell rose from his blanket without a word, walked to the edge of the circular clearing, and stood there facing the dark tree line for nearly a full minute before Doss called out to ask what he was looking at. Pell answered in a voice too calm for the hour, "Someone's coming down to get us." I recognized the walk. Nobody else could see anyone at all. By Rourke's field book, the fourth day began with Thaddeus Pell gone, not missing in the way a man wanders off, but simply absent from his blanket at first light, his boots left neatly beside the cold fire, laced as though he had stepped out of them on purpose rather than been taken out of them by force. There was no sign in the dirt that he had walked anywhere at all. No drag marks, no footprints leaving the clearing in any direction, as though he had simply stopped being where he was without ever crossing the ground in between. Doss wanted to search. Rourke, who by then had stopped sleeping and had begun writing shorter and shorter entries in a hand growing less steady by the page, told him plainly that searching for a man on that ridge was how you lost a second man, and that the only sane choice left was to turn back toward the second crossing, while there was still light enough to see the trail. They walked for 6 hours by Rourke's count, and covered by every landmark Doss could recognize, no distance at all. The same split hickory, the same mossed boulder, the same bend in a dry creek bed, passing beneath them 3 separate times, each time a little later in a day that seemed unwilling to end. It was Speck who finally admitted what all 3 of them had noticed and none had said, that their own footprints from the first passing were still visible in the soft trail dirt each time they returned to it, meaning they had genuinely walked the same ground 3 times over in a straight line and arrived nowhere. At dusk on the 4th day, Thaddeus Pell walked out of the tree line toward their fire, upright, unhurried, smiling the particular half-smile he always smiled, wearing his boots, though he had left them by the fire the night he vanished, and said, "There you are. I've been looking everywhere for you 3. Let's get off this ridge before full dark." Rourke did not move toward him. He asked him where he had been. Pell answered easily, naturally, with a small laugh, that he had only walked a little way to relieve himself and gotten turned around in the dark, and that he'd been calling for them the whole time and couldn't understand why none of them had answered. Doss, who had shared a tent with Thaddeus Pell for 11 months of field work, noticed that Pell's shadow, cast long by the low fire, fell toward the flames instead of away from them, exactly as Pell's own had done the day before, and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would help. He only watched it the way you watch a candle guttering in a draft you can't locate, hoping that if he looked away long enough, it would correct itself on its own. Rourke asked him to remove his hat. Pell, still smiling, said he was tired, that they were all tired, that they should eat and sleep and start down again at first light, and did not remove his hat, and continued gently and reasonably to suggest they all simply come and sit by him at the fire. Rourke's final legible field note, recovered later from the book stuffed inside his coat, reads only, "Whatever is wearing Pell's boots knows Pell's laugh Pell's limp, and the exact words Pell would use. It does not know that Pell always removes his hat at a fire out of respect for his late mother, who taught him that manner, and who is the only thing left in this world it has not thought to imitate. Neither Micah Doss nor Nathaniel Speck spoke of what happened in the hour that followed to anyone who survived to write it down, and Nuna told me that her father never learned the particulars either. Only that Cornelius Rourke came down alone off that ridge 11 days after going up, wearing another man's boots, carrying a book that had not existed when he left, and speaking for the first mile in a voice that was not entirely his own. Walker Swiftwater found Rourke at the second crossing on the 11th day, past the 5 he had promised to wait, because something in him, some instinct older than any contract, had refused to leave the creek and had kept a small fire burning there every night in case. Rourke did not speak until the second morning after he was found. When he finally did, he told Walker only one thing clearly, that the mountain had not taken all 3 of the others by force, that one of them had gone willingly, quietly, in the middle of a night when the bell rang and a voice called a name that fit too well, and that this, the willing going, was somehow the part the mountain wanted most. Walker asked him what the book was, the one Rourke would not let out of his coat. Rourke said it was a survey log he had found at the circular clearing, decades old by its condition, and that it recorded a mining party from long before his own, men whose names matched almost exactly the names carried by 4 Cherokee brothers who had vanished from that same ridge 2 generations earlier, back when the debt, Walker realized only then, had first been opened rather than paid. That is the part of the story Nuna told me she had never told anyone outside her family, that the mountain's debt did not begin with white surveyors in 1878. It began earlier, with her own great-grandfather's generation, with a bargain struck in hunger during a winter so hard that 4 brothers went up onto that ridge and did not come back, and something was left owing ever since to whichever side of that bargain had gone unpaid. Every survey party, every timber crew, every curious wanderer who climbed past the second crossing since then had simply been feeding the same account, one person at a time, generation after generation, white and Cherokee both, because the mountain, Nuna said, does not care whose grandfather it is owed to. It only cares that somebody comes to settle it. Rourke went back to Knoxville within the month, resigned his position, and never surveyed another acre of wilderness in his life. He wrote his wife every detail of his ordinary days for the rest of his marriage, and never once mentioned Thaddeus Pell's name again, though Nuna's father kept, for decades, a letter Rourke had sent him privately, thanking him for waiting the extra 6 days no contract had required. Micah Doss and Nathaniel Speck were never found, alive or dead, though 11 years later a hunter came down off that same ridge carrying a pocketbook with Doss's name inside the cover, its final legible entry reading only that he could hear Speck's voice above him on the trail, though he has been gone on ahead of me a very long time now. Walker Swiftwater refused every guide contract offered to him for the rest of his life after that autumn, and told his daughter, when she was old enough to understand it, that the ridge would ask for another payment some day, because it always did, on a schedule that had nothing to do with human patience. Nuna told me, on that porch above Sorrow Creek, that the last payment had come due 19 years before I climbed up to see her, a hiker, a stranger to the hollow, who went up alone one October afternoon and was found 6 days later, sitting calmly at the second crossing, unharmed, unable to explain where he had been, missing nothing but every memory of his own mother's face. The account is settled again for a while, she told me, and for the first time in our whole conversation, she looked away from the ridge and directly at me. But it is never settled for good. That is the only lie people tell themselves about a debt like that one. Now you know the accounting. Do with it what you will. Write it, tell it, warn people with it. Just remember that a story like this one has a way of collecting its own kind of interest from whoever carries it down the mountain. I wrote my feature that autumn, though it bore almost no resemblance to the polite little piece my editors had asked for, and it ran with most of the mountain stripped out of it, because no one in that newsroom would have printed the rest. I never went back to Sorrow Creek. I heard some years later, second-hand and unconfirmed, that Nuna Swiftwater died peacefully in that same cabin, and that the family kept her wake with every window shuttered and every mirror in the house turned to face the wall, though nobody who told me the story would explain why that particular custom mattered, only that it had always been done that way in her family after a death, and that it would go on being done that way long after anyone remembered exactly what it was guarding against. I think of the marker tree sometimes, and of a name carved level with a man's own eyes before he had ever lifted a knife to it. I have never gone looking for a mountain of my own, but I have learned the way Cornelius Rourke learned, the way you may be learning right now simply by finishing this story, that some debts are inherited the moment you hear the full accounting of them, and the mountain, wherever your mountain happens to be, is very, very patient.